The Future is Now by Emmanuel Todd. Introduction to Lineages of the Feminine, an outline of a history of women. It's clear that we are living through an anthropological revolution. Here at the beginning of the third millennium, we have seen the emergence of the Me Too phenomenon, which was given global momentum by the Harvey Weinstein affair in 2017. In its less elegant French version, this wave turned into Balance ton port. On the walls of Paris and provincial towns, denunciations of what has been called femicide have flourished. The paradox of this renewed protest against men, a protest violent in its expression and evocative of a structural antagonism between the two sexes, lies in the fact that it began just as the women's liberation movement seemed on the point of achieving its goals. I'm not claiming here, which would be absurd, that all the goals of feminism have been achieved. Far from it. Women have certainly gained massive access to the labor market, but significant wage inequalities remain. Their share in low-paid temporary work is still much higher than that of men in Western countries, where a thin layer of male domination in the highest positions remains. The top stratum of organizations is still mostly occupied by men, in politics, in public administration, and in the private capitalist sector of the economy. See Table 0.1. But the general trend is clear. These remnants of domination are being rapidly eroded. The positive acceleration between 2000 and 2022 is impressive. The number of women entering elected assemblies in the West is increasing according to a curve that seems exponential. Since the publication of the French edition of this book, the war in Ukraine has mobilized a multitude of women actors at the highest level in the Western camp. Prime ministers in Scandinavia, directors of intelligence and Ukrainian affairs in the United States, heads of foreign affairs in the United Kingdom and Germany, a minister of defense in France, a top representative of the European Union in Brussels. I am only mentioning a few examples, but here, for the first time in history, is a global conflict in which men are not the only actors. Some sectors, such as private capitalism, are resisting the rise of women, but others, such as the cultural sector, are already showing a predominance of women right up to the top of the ladder. I will explain this resistance by new contradictions in the female condition, brought about by emancipation rather than by a masculinist plot. It is true that in the United States, the Supreme Court's reversal of the Roe v. Wade ruling on freedom of abortion, which has made it possible for some American states, a minority among states and an even smaller minority in terms of population, to actually ban abortion, is a serious attack on women's right to control their own bodies. But I'll give a detailed and tragic interpretation of the pro-life regression, in terms of social class and increased mortality, rather than of a lowering of the status of women in the states concerned. This book will suggest that we give the North-South divide, or the influence of the religious right, too much importance in our interpretation of the conflict over abortion. Educational stratification and class conflict have emerged as the dominant factors in the recent aggravation of the conflict. The fact remains that in the global context of an accelerating emancipation of women, the antagonistic feminist revival, a new revolutionary upsurge at heart, is not logical, even if it must be admitted that the development of concrete history is rarely logical. To better understand the problem, let's go back to the history of a previous revolution, the rise of socialism, and to the opening of the revisionist quarrel that divided Marxists from the end of the 19th century. Edward Bernstein, 1850 to 1932, pointed out from an empirical perspective that concrete capitalism, far from leading to an ever-increasing concentration of capital and impoverishment of the workers, as predicted by Marx, in fact, led to an increase in the standard of living of the masses, allowed for a diversity of sizes of enterprises, and did not prevent the development of the middle classes. Any revolutionary catastrophism could only lead, in his view, to the justification of an anti-popular and anti-democratic reaction. Current data on the status of women in the West should have led to the emergence of a feminist and female Bernstein. But what we are seeing is the rise of a new antagonism, a logical cousin to Leninist-style catastrophism, yet without any 1914-18 warlike catastrophe to explain the new antagonistic trajectory of feminism. At the deepest and hardest level of antagonistic feminism, we find the theme of femicide, which evokes an evil essence of man in his relationship to woman, just as Leninism considered the bourgeois as inherently evil, incapable of accepting the humanity of the proletarian. The existence of a specifically masculine violence is indubitable. It can be verified in all its atrocity back to the mists of time. But confusing random fluctuations with long-term trends often entails serious errors in analysis. Caution was needed, for example, when analyzing the observed increase of 21% in the number of women killed in France by their partners or ex-partners between 2018 and 2019, 146 as against 121. This increase was not statistically significant. The number of women killed by their partners had been 148 in 2006 when measurements began, and 179 in 2007. An article by Cédric Mathieu in Libération, written before the publication of the figures for 2019, quite rightly noted a drop in cases of femicide from 2006 onward, and a stagnation over the last 6 years. In 2020, 90 femicides were committed. Let's extend the area studied to Europe and Japan. While it's true that at least half of the women who are victims of homicide are killed by their partners, a global demographic approach indicates that the trend, since 1985, has shown a significant decline. See figure 0.1. Without wishing to minimize the horror of these crimes, there is evidently a considerable gap between the rising emotions stirred by this subject and the reality of its downward trend, and we must also note the ideological indifference that prevails vis-à-vis other much more socially and sexually significant phenomena of violence. Suicide rates, for example, are heavily biased against men. 1,985 female suicides and 6,450 male suicides took place in France in 2016. Yes, men are more violent. To deny this would be absurd, but most of their violence is turned against themselves or against other men. Let's look at wartime fatalities, which are very masculine in nature despite indiscriminate bombardments, or in peacetime all of the homicide data, where men account for 65% of victims in France. Still, while the emotion associated with femicide doesn't seem linked to any aggravation of the problem, it's a social fact that we can't ignore. Let's take a step back. We must first consider the statistically more massive phenomena that demonstrate the considerable historical progress in the situation of women. Of course, we can still measure, as I said, differences in salary, in the distribution of part-time jobs, and the remnants of male dominance in the economic and public spheres. But the empowerment of women through employment remains the fundamental phenomenon. The most recent years have seen a decisive ascent of women in the political field in France, the Anglo-American world, and Scandinavia, if we stick to the three main hubs of women's liberation in the developed world. Above all, for the first time in human history, the educational relation between the sexes has shifted. All upsurges in literacy have involved men taking the lead. In Sweden, women caught up with and overtook men especially early in the 18th century, but they had to catch up with them first, of course. Even Sweden, a country where feminism has become a matter of identity, and one that is proud of its leading position in women's liberation in terms of all the parameters of the Gender Gap Global Report, did not escape an initial male predominance. The only groups and societies where women have become literate faster than men are Black American, Brazilian, Colombian, and West Indian. But this is because the family and the status of fathers had been deliberately destroyed in those cultures by slavers who were white and male. I will return to the particular family situation of black women in the New World later in this book. What are we now seeing in advanced countries? Women more often go into higher education for shorter or longer courses than men. The latest figures from the OECD tell us that in 2019, among 25 to 34-year-olds in France, 52% of women had followed shorter or longer higher education courses as compared to 44% of men. In the United Kingdom, it was 55% of women as compared to 49% of men. In the United States, the figures were 55% women and 46% men. In Italy, there was a significant gap, but at lower levels. There were 34% higher educated women aged 25 to 34 and 22% men. In Japan, the difference was small but at high levels. 64% women and 59% men. Russia has a surprise up its sleeve for us. The figures were 69% for women and 55% for men, although it's not clear whether the definition of higher education there is directly comparable to that of the countries of the OECD. Germany deviates from the common law. The rates here were fairly low and not very different by sex. 34% for women, 32% for men. China finally had 18% men and 18% women with a higher education. But this is a less advanced country, one in which, as we will see, the status of women has been brought down particularly low by a very lengthy history, one that we will study. Although we can still find everywhere an overrepresentation of men in the very upper levels of higher education, something I'll discuss later in this book, we still have to admit that the uneducated masses are predominantly male today. An individual's education largely prefigures his or her profession, and these figures tell the crystal ball gazer that the basic problem of feminist demands will be solved in the not-too-distant future. This, at least, is what a feminist and female Bernstein would have deduced from present trends. It's true that all types of higher education are not professionally equal, and that there are important areas of male resistance, particularly in France when it comes to the sciences and the highly selective Grande École. I will discuss the meaning of these resistances, their causes and their consequences in due course. But we're now in a situation where friendly and reformist thinking should dominate, rather than any perception of men as murderers. Such progress could not have happened without the existence of fathers, and mothers, of course, concerned about the education of their daughters, or rather of fathers who did not view the education of their daughters as any less important than the education of their sons. Yet it is among these educated women that an antagonistic conception of the relations between the sexes is often born and flourishes. The struggles of third-wave feminism may not be the crux of the problem. The success among the French middle classes of a book like Mona Chollet's In Defense of Witches points rather to a sense of disorientation. How can so many modern women these days identify with the almost 40,000 women massacred by male fury in the 16th and 17th centuries? There's something strange here, a kind of glitch in the process of women's liberation. Whenever there's a paradox, contradiction, or some strangeness in a social phenomenon, my instinct as a researcher is alerted, as here. It's often by observing anomalies and making them part and parcel of one's reflection in order to explain them that science progresses. The glitch we observe in women's liberation must be explained. Hitherto, I have to admit, the question of feminism hadn't interested me. One might say that there's another, minor, paradox here, since my job is the analysis of family systems, the heart of which is precisely the relationship between men and women. Historical anthropology analyzes the evolution of this relationship. It focuses on patrilineality, the priority given to the male lineage, and to matrilineality, the rarer equivalent for the female lineage, a phenomenon that does not imply any feminine power. Patrilocality and matrilocality, when a young couple settle near the family of the husband or wife, etc. I have devoted several books to these problems, tracing in particular the long history of the family systems of Eurasia and resulting in the definition of an original form of the family of Homo sapiens. I've identified correspondences between forms of the peasant family and the type of ideology emerging as a result of literacy and secularization. I showed that some aspects of long-term cultural dynamism could be explained by a relatively high status afforded to women. I ended up diagnosing in my last book the disappearance of the regional family systems that for centuries had organized the territory of France. I had clearly perceived how women had overtaken men educationally in the majority of European countries, but I had not made much of this transformation, even though it is highly surprising. After all, in Sapiens, it abolished between 100,000 and 300,000 years of patridominance, to use the concept defined by American anthropology. But precisely, women's liberation was well underway, and I didn't see what I could have contributed to something that wasn't actually a problem, even if I realized that a certain Western narcissism prevented us from perceiving the cause of the resistance that Chinese, Indian, Arabic, Afghan, and even to some extent Japanese, German, and Russian patrilineal societies evinced towards our values. The emergence of internal contradictions, of a glitch in women's liberation in the Western world in the strict sense, mainly the Anglo-American world, France and Scandinavia, has made me change my mind. Historical anthropology can help us to understand our present and future difficulties. The singularity of the original human couple. To understand the importance of the transformation we are undergoing, we will first need to track the status of women over the last 5,000 or even 10,000 years, ever since the appearance of writing or even agriculture. In this way, we will realize that the feminist evolution of the Western world has, since the 1920s, reversed a major historical trend towards giving women a lower status, a trend observable in its fullness at the center of the Eurasian mass, just as in Africa and New Guinea. But because the most recent feminism includes a new antagonism between the sexes, we will need, if we are really to understand the importance of these issues for the future of the species, to go even further back in the history of the human couple. As an animal species, human beings differ from their cousins, the chimpanzees, by their ability to establish long-term ties between the two sexes. Monogamy, a tempered monogamy, has statistically dominated the species Homo sapiens since its appearance between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago in Africa. This observation of a stable, original link between men and women, of which I am here giving merely an outline, reserving a more detailed analysis for Chapter 4, is relatively recent. It was not the conclusion reached by late 19th century anthropologists. The founding fathers of the discipline believed in a primitive sexual communism. These serious-minded middle-class men projected onto the savages of the past a sexual life contrary to their own morality, one that was a vaguely pornographic fantasy. The breaking of the pansexualist consensus was brought about by a Swedish-speaking Finn, a teacher at the London School of Economics, Edward Westermarck, 1862 to 1939, who, ethnographic data in hand with his The History of Human Marriage, 1891, destroyed the idea of a primitive sexual promiscuity. We owe him not only one of the first formulations of the most commonly accepted thesis today, but also the explanation which remains the most convincing and the most fundamental, the idea of an original nuclear family that was naturally selected for its effectiveness in bringing up the young. This is the conclusion to which I myself came, after many other people and by a different methodological path, in L'origine des systèmes familiaux, the origin of family systems. The nuclear family is simply a father and a mother with their children, and it is the basic unit of hunter-gatherer societies, heirs to the lifestyle of the original Homo sapiens, the surviving representatives of which we have been able to study, mainly in America and Australia, but also in southern and eastern Africa and in Southeast Asia. Here, the single household is part of a group that contains several other nuclear families, most often related via the men or the women. It doesn't matter which. The young couple, once married, form their own household, but they can co-reside for a time with a related couple. They are quite capable of taking in the elderly, widowers, and this or that isolated individual. Such a couple is most often monogamous, but marriage, in its customary sense, with two wives is possible, polygyny, though it doesn't involve more than 15% of cases, as is the case, as I am increasingly convinced, with the marriage of one woman with several men, polyandry. An examination of the Shoshone groups of the inner basin of the Rocky Mountains, which I will examine in detail, strongly points to an originally natural polyandry. Westermarck sees the nuclear family as following a Darwinian-type evolutionary logic. Why do human beings, unlike chimpanzees, not live in sexual promiscuity where everyone sleeps with everyone else, even if a few dominant males breed more efficiently than others? What advantage is there for the species in a lasting bond between a man and a woman? The key is the long time it takes to bring up a human child. A baby comes out of its mother's womb in a remarkable state of unpreparedness, primary altriciality, and it takes about 15 years to rear it, secondary altriciality. Collaboration between the two members of the couple is a condition for the possibility of this exceptional upbringing. Unlike the male chimpanzee, who doesn't know whose father he really is, a man can invest time in his children's upbringing because the bond he maintains with their mother allows him to be their father. Two invariants characterize the original human family. First of all, there is an undeniable political male predominance in the local group. It's not an overwhelming predominance, far from it, but it does exist. Then there is a sexual division of labor. When we examine all the examples of hunter-gatherer societies that have been ethnographed, we find that men hunt and women gather. In some cases, the men also gather, but the women almost never hunt. The men and women, who these days are disturbed and exasperated by the way men monopolize hunting, invariably cite the case of the few Agta women, the Negrito group in the Philippines, who sometimes go hunting. These marginal cases do not represent much statistically when you look closely at the data. I will come back to this. The original human family type is efficient and flexible, and it has ensured the success of the species. We therefore find at its heart a stable, economic, and emotional bond between a man and a woman, a bond that can usually tolerate divorce, abortion, infanticide, and a certain degree of polygyny or polyandry. The element of inequality in favor of the males that we have found cannot counterbalance the weight of collaboration and solidarity within the couple, necessary for survival in the environment specific to the hunter-gatherers. Research versus ideology. The now dominant ideology of the Western world, third-wave feminism, has distorted the history of relations between the sexes. By no means all historical propositions put forward by this kind of feminism are absurd. Its vision of witchcraft trials as a war on women by power-hungry men seems to me essentially correct. It is verifiable that the Berdache phenomenon, in which American Indian men are able to take on a woman's economic and sexual status, is primordial to human beings, as I will explain later. But third-wave feminism, with its central but uncertain concepts of gender and patriarchy, flattens history out, mixing together all levels of masculine dominance without really understanding them. The first part of this book is a reorganization of the concepts of the relations between men and women, and of the history of these relations. I have worked in a methodical way, producing a critical examination of the feminist contribution to my two basic disciplines, anthropology and history. My conclusion is simple. Feminism has had a dynamic effect on history and has positively destroyed anthropology with the force of dynamite. I then retrace the history of the status of women through the history of family systems to place the West, narrowly understood, the Anglo-American world, France, and Scandinavia, within the general evolution of humanity. We will then be able to perceive Westerners as the direct, legitimate descendants of the hunter-gatherers. Here, women's status has never been lowered as it has in Japan, Germany, and Russia, level 1, in China, level 2, and in northern India and the Arab world, level 3. The low status of women in Africa and New Guinea can be considered as intermediate between levels 2 and 3. To describe this historical pattern, I will be making a new cartographic use of the ethnographic atlas of George Peter Murdoch, 1897 to 1985, and the tabulations of Lewis R. Binford, 1931 to 2011, on hunter-gatherers, two databases digitized and posted on the D-Place platform by a team from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History at Jena. The reader will of course find our mapping of data from the atlas throughout the pages of this book, but also in a form that he or she will be able to explore in detail thanks to an app that we have put online. Defining a starting point for the history of the human family is crucial. After 10 years of reflection, I have chosen the North American model of the original family instead of the Australian Aboriginal model dear to Durkheim, Freud, and more recently, Alain Testard. I will explain why. The problem is not so much the economic and emotional association between men and women, which is common to both models, but the status of women, a status that was high among the Indians of Northwest America, but very low among the Australian Aborigines, where it combined very significant age differences between spouses and a very large degree of polygyny. Without this in-depth historical examination, we could not understand the violence of the shift we are experiencing, or feel how disorienting it is in magnitude, even before we ponder the viability of the anthropological system which is now trying to establish itself. In 70 years, conceptions more than 100,000 years old have been reversed. But not everywhere on the planet. The patrilineal world, which after all still includes 3/4 of humanity, is still resisting. This book integrates religion with historical anthropology. The co-evolution of religion and family seems more and more obvious to me. To understand the differences between the current feminisms of the three hubs of the West as narrowly understood, I will need to examine how Christianity, followed by the Protestant Reformation, changed family forms and impacted on the status of women in those areas. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia are, more than France, the dominant hubs of Western feminism. They are also countries with a Protestant tradition. This fact, so obvious and simple, nonetheless confronts us with a paradox. Protestantism, born in Germany in the 16th century, was clearly patricentric and included an anti-feminist nuance to which English-speaking and Scandinavian societies had to adapt, accepting it, attenuating it, rejecting it, or all three at the same time. I must here recognize an intellectual debt to feminism, a movement that is absolutely right to denounce history as a discipline which has long been blind to women. I have in mind not just the history of events, made up of wars and conquests, all the endless agitation of men in arms, but also the study of all the elements of social life. In my Lineages of Modernity, I failed to fully realize the historical importance of Protestant patricentrism, and thus the problems that this patricentrism raised for the Anglo-American world. The present book can be considered as a rebalanced, even feminized complement to my previous outline of human history. The experience is fascinating for me as I have realized how much my self-identity as an anthropologist involved paying attention to women, while my self-identity as a historian was masculine in the most banal sense of the word. The power of women today. Now that we have set out the history of the longue durée, it will be quite easy to talk about our present. The glitch in women's liberation will make sense. What we are experiencing is the accentuation of a rather high status given to women, and not the overthrow of some fantasized patriarchal order. I will show how liberation is possible, and even natural, once the technological conditions of safe and secure contraception and economic abundance have been met. The absence of a serious and solid male rejection of this liberation will have been a fundamental element in anthropological evolution. I would be tempted to say that the destruction of patriarchy was easy for us because it had never really existed. Some fathers and mothers were afraid that their daughters might fall pregnant. Yes. Men and women specialized economically to survive in harsh conditions. Yes. But were men truly convinced of their intrinsic superiority? No. I'm fully aware that I'm exaggerating things a bit here to make my argument clear. Still, no blood-stained revolutionary confrontation was necessary to pave the way for the educational and sexual liberation of women, simply because men, husbands, fathers, and brothers, benefited from it too. The first two waves of feminism certainly gave many men the opportunity to utter many silly generalities about women, but the speed of the shift shows how tenuous and fragile masculine dominance was, and how it hardly counted given the extent of the habits of cooperation between men and women. This collaboration is the basis of human nature when it has not been reoriented by the patrilineal principle. I will here summarize the three feminist stages or waves, of which the first two aim to correct the imbalance of the initial masculine domination, moderate in nature, as I have said, in bilateral kinship systems. First, the citizenship phase. From the end of the 19th century, suffragettes claimed the right to vote. This first demand was satisfied in the United States in 1920 by universal female suffrage. In England, it took two steps. In 1918, suffrage was granted to women, but at a later age than that of men, 30 rather than 21. From 1928, the minimum age changed to 21 for both sexes. In Sweden, experiments in women's suffrage in municipal elections took place from the 18th century, with various extensions going backward and forward until the end of the 19th century. Women's suffrage in national elections to the Riksdag was granted in 1919, in time for the 1921 elections. France was particularly conservative here, since French women had to wait until 1944 to have the right to vote. The French delay cannot, however, be interpreted as the expression of direct anti-feminism. The radical socialist, meaning extremely moderate, left feared that the link between women and Catholicism might give the right undue influence. If we accept that the Church had established a special bond with women, and in a way represented them, we can understand that anxiety. The connection between women and Christianity will be discussed in Chapter 8. The interplay between gaining the right to vote and the savage masculine violence of the two world wars is obvious. However, the entry of women into political life did not lead to any immediate upheavals. The second phase was that of sexuality. It opened with Pincus's invention of the contraceptive pill in the United States. This was put on the market on the American side of the Atlantic in 1961 and authorized by the Neuwirth Law in France in 1967. When we worry today about the status of women, we don't always fully measure the risks of the sexual act for them before the pill. This opened up to them, but also to their masculine partners, the possibility of a different sexual life. parents no longer needed to fear for their daughters. This second phase culminated with the legalization of abortion. Here, Britain led, with the passing of the Abortion Act in 1967. Note that Britain is the appropriate term, as Northern Ireland was left out. The United States followed on a national scale in 1973, with the Supreme Court passing its decision in Roe v. Wade. France quickly followed the Anglo-American world with the Veil Law of 1975. The main progress was made between the 1960s and the 1980s. This period was also that of a massive entry of women into the labor market. In the mid-1980s, a third phase began, and the debate shifted from women's liberation to a questioning of what men and women actually are, a re-examination of their essential natures: biological, social, antagonistic, stable, negotiable. This was the period of identity which came to France later than in the United States. Judith Butler's gender trouble should be seen as an important ideological step because it took to its most absurd consequences the use of the concept of gender, which became popular during feminism's Phase 2. This text, as fundamental as it was obscure, appeared in 1990. It was an academic text inspired by French theory: Derrida, Foucault, Wittig, Kristeva, a guarantee of opacity, and it had an unparalleled impact in the United States. It is still a marvelous illustration of the conceptual difficulties that arise, necessarily and without limits, if the binary opposition masculine-feminine, an opposition that has contributed with many other conceptual pairs, top-bottom, left-right, day-night, past-future, hot-cold, to the structuring of human thought, is undermined. The very obscurity of the text was programmatic because it prefigured the confusion of the debates involving changes in sex, gender, and sexual orientation. Thanks to it, we are prepared for the present-day world in which lesbians on noisy gay pride marches in San Francisco and London denounced transgender women as masculine submarines who have infiltrated the feminist movement. At this point, let me sincerely announce that I will be a conceptual conservative in this book, perhaps even a reactionary, since the term gender has now supplanted that of sex in the human sciences. In spite of this, I will stick to the opposition of two sexes, the one feminine, the other masculine, defined by the ability, except in cases of accidental sterility or the inability to carry a child. But the concept of gender does exist socially, and I will study its meaning and spread in Chapter 1. I will explain later in the book why, without a conservative conceptual definition of the two sexes, one cannot understand ongoing developments such as the transgender phenomenon. Thus, my decision is not ideological. It just dawned on me after several months of sincere efforts to move away from a stable, biologically based view of men and women that I could no longer carry out my research because categories that are too shifting prohibit any understanding of social reality and its evolution. I can't be the only person who is looking for fixed marks in these days of conceptual turbulence. The term gender is on the way not only to becoming hegemonic, but above all to assuming in a large majority of texts the exact meaning that the word sex used to have. If the word gender replaces the word sex, it becomes impossible to distinguish the social from the biological, while pretending to do so. And this loss of conceptual precision makes it impossible to analyze the current ideological transformation. So we have citizenship, sexuality, and identity. And in this last period, the rise in France, it happened much earlier in the United States, of the representation, I'm not talking about reality here, of a relationship between the sexes no longer based on collaboration and solidarity, but on antagonism. So our original question remains: why have we witnessed this recent rise, in France and elsewhere, in cultural and ideological life, of an antagonistic conception of the relations between men and women? I will give my answer straight away in its most general form. The situation is explained by the fact that women's liberation has essentially already taken place, but it did not have all the positive effects that were expected, and led to some consequences or correlates that were indeed regrettable. Our belief in the excellence of women's liberation is such that the negativity of the present time prevents us from seeing that women are, in many domains, already in power. I'd approached my research for this book as an effort to anticipate the future and glimpse a coming matriarchal order of one kind or another. But what I found, after reviewing the educational, demographic, and sexual parameters, was that, from the beginning of the 2000s, an already established situation of ideological matridominance, my terminology here again derives from American anthropology, was encountering a de facto economic resistance. This resistance results from contradictions within feminine identity, much more than from any desire for masculine domination. Women are now the actors of their own history, and they have access not just to freedom, but at the same time to a direct encounter, independent of their partners, with economic anxiety, social conflicts, Durkheimian enemy, and a questioning as banal as it is tragic of the human condition. They are no longer social minors, and some of them, in certain socioeconomic groups, are manifesting social pathologies that were formerly a male preserve: false consciousness, resentment, scapegoating. I sometimes think that this book, basically indifferent to any ideology, could serve to define a fourth-generation feminism because it treats women as social adults rather than victims. Ideological matridominance did not take place in a happy world. No sunny utopia resulted from the massive entry of women into the labor market, from their material independence and their new political weight. Some positive effects are evident, such as a drop in physical violence, as well as a decline in racism. I will show in this book that the fairly rapid overcoming of homophobia, leading to marriage for all, is one of the important effects of the new ideological power of women, and that the LGBT complex itself has gone into matricentral mode since the beginning of the third millennium. But the era of women is also one marked by a drop in economic dynamism and the standard of living, and by a collapse of the feeling of equality between human beings in general. It is characterized by the decay of the freedom of expression, a phenomenon most often referred to by the term politically correct, and an authoritarianism of a new kind, diffuse and widespread, though not violent. Even more fundamental is the collapse in the sense of the collective, which blocks any political or economic action in France, or twists it into strange shapes in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Sweden. The era of women is also that of elitism and populism, censorship and conspiracy theories. Am I here trying to make women's liberation responsible for all the regressions we are witnessing? Of course not. That would be silly. The two halves of humanity are also collaboratively involved in the emergence of regrettable social phenomena. But a researcher cannot be satisfied with a heterogeneous social world where nothing can be connected to anything else. Worse, a world where we can put all the positives on one side and all the negatives on the other, without ever raising the question of an interaction between the two spheres. This would mean putting feminism, the empowerment of women, peace, homosexual marriage, ecology, and the abolition of races on the one side, and rising inequality, falling worker wages, deindustrialization, the rise of fierce tension between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, and the emergence of a French state that is running amok on the other. This kind of depiction would bring us back to the Middle Ages, with its random universe and its disconnected processes, explicable solely in terms of the local interventions of a god without a plan, or of a devil hell-bent on thwarting his superior. Seeing the ideological power of women in the context of the present, or better, of the last 20 years, rather than placing it in some indefinitely postponed future, immediately eliminates the currently dominant interpretation that tacitly underlies so many assessments, and deems that what is good is feminine, while what is bad results from a persistence of masculine domination. A masculine domination whose negative effects increase at the same rate as women's liberation would be too reminiscent of the USSR, where the consequences of capitalism worsened with each step forward in communism. The clash with reality threatens all ideologies, whether predominantly economic or anthropological, and all ideologies react in the same way. Economics and anthropology. The obligation to grasp simultaneously, in the present, the evolution of relations between men and women, the terminal collapse of religion, the economic crises, and the collapse of democracy have finally led me to revise my general interpretive model. Work on hunter-gatherers, in particular, made me give up a view of history that put anthropology above economics. The original human couple, in the context of their bilateral kinship group, collaborated in reproduction, child-rearing, and the acquisition of resources without it being possible to seriously hierarchize those functions which are all equally necessary for the survival of the species. The first division of labor was, as we have seen, sexual. Since writing L'illusion économique in 1997, I had constructed a representation of social life and history in 3 layers: conscious, subconscious, unconscious. In the conscious, I place politics and economics in all eras. Journalists tell us about it every day, differing little from the medieval chroniclers in their perception of these levels. Education today is a matter of the subconscious. Parents know its importance for the destiny of their children, and the OECD measures its quantity and quality in its member countries to try to understand their economic performance. But there is nowadays a reluctance to see that education defines the movement of history itself better than the economy does. For Condorcet, Hegel, and Durkheim, literacy was the very march of progress, of the human spirit, or of social disarray. Their perception was the common and conscious opinion of their times among the bourgeois elites as much as among the poorest of the people. Thus education oscillates historically between the conscious and the subconscious. I situate religion today at the interface of the subconscious and the unconscious. In the Middle Ages, as in the time of the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, the social importance of religion was fully accepted, conscious, to put it mildly. People were in communion with one another or killed each other in its name. Today, using the concept of zombie Catholicism to explain a low unemployment rate or a neo-republicanism that doesn't like Islam triggers a sense of surprise, oscillating between disbelief and fury because our religious structuring has become unconscious. Yet we cannot understand our time without grasping the elements of social life that represent a survival of religious attitudes beyond the death of belief, properly speaking. I will need to describe a zombie Protestantism to understand English, American, and Swedish feminisms, and a zombie Christianity to understand gay identity and the transgender phenomenon. I place in the unconscious at all times family structures, that is to say, in this book, the relations between men and women. Many authors, from Aristotle to Freud, have noted the existence of a relationship between the authority of the father and political authority. But Frédéric Leplay's work on the diversity of family structures, which alone makes it possible to explain the diversity of ideological temperaments, has not been heeded, and mainstream political science fails to perceive the anthropological structuring of today's world. Family values lie in the unconscious of societies. I still believe in this representation which distinguishes between conscious, subconscious, and unconscious layers. But I have realized that its effective simplicity led me to a logical mistake. I slipped without thinking from the image of superimposed layers to the idea that what is deepest and most exciting to discover is inherently more important than what lies on the surface. I, unconsciously, followed psychoanalysis in its suggestion that the most buried and obscure was the essential thing, neglecting the force of consciousness and the will in what makes a human being. But a 3-layered representation of history can work quite well without us hierarchizing the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious elements. Historical processes involving family structures unfold over a very long period of time and without people seeing them. They are very important. But the economy, which people see clearly and which can act violently in the shorter term, is just as important. I will give a concrete example to illustrate my error. I've often used the crisis of 1929 to show the importance of the family and of religion in determining national historical trajectories. I said that the economic crisis led to the New Deal in the United States, to the Popular Front in France, to the Conservatives in England, and to Nazism in Germany. Unconscious family structures, authoritarian and non-egalitarian in Germany, liberal and egalitarian in France, liberal and non-egalitarian in Anglo-Saxon countries, and sub- or unconscious religious transformations, faith collapsed in England and Germany between 1870 and 1930, explain the divergence between the advanced nations. This interpretation remains absolutely correct, but I have long seen in this example the proof of a causal superiority of anthropology over the economy. This was a logical mistake which failed to note something equally obvious. Without the economic crisis of 1929, we are equally unable to explain the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, or French Prime Minister Léon Blum. In the present work, I will begin to apply a unified problematic. Like the description of hunter-gatherer families that I proposed above, characterized by the sexual division of labor, this problematic will not separate the question of equality and inequality between men and women, in other words, anthropology, from economic life. We will see how the economy determines the family, and the family the economy, according to a causal sequence of a new type, where conscious and unconscious phenomena combine with and follow each other, without being a priori placed in any hierarchical order. The subconscious, whether educational or religious, will also occupy a place of equal importance in the causal sequences. In women's liberation, the link with socio-economic, technological, and scientific evolution is obvious. We can simply note the invention of the pill, placed on the American market at the very beginning of the 1960s. There is no sexual revolution without endocrinology. There is also, within the general mishmash of cultural changes, and still in the 1960s, a rise in the standard of living and in the aspirations of those populations with full employment. An optimistic economic world without which it is difficult to imagine the relatively untroubled elevation in the status of women. Times of economic crisis have equally significant consequences for family organization, of which women are not the only victims. In her 1940 book, The Unemployed Man and His Family, the American sociologist Mira Komarovsky, 1905-99, showed the destructive effect of the Great Depression on the status of fathers. A study of how the link between men and women interacts with economic life leads naturally to an examination of how the relations between the sexes interact with the relations between social classes. There are notable differences in the place occupied by women within the couple according to their social position. In 1957, the classic by Michael Young, 1915-2002, and Peter Wilmot, 1923-2000, Family and Kinship in East London, highlighted the matricentric character of working-class families, in contradiction with the vision often held by the educated petty bourgeoisie. Olivier Schwartz, born in 1951, refined their analysis in Le Monde Privé des Ouvriers, the private world of the working classes, which concerns working-class circles in northern France and dates from 1990. In contrast, what was observed in the Western world as a whole was a rather masculine inflection of the world of the upper and petty bourgeoisie, with its well-known association between property and masculine domination. More recently, Hannah Rosin's 2012 book, The End of Men, describes how men in the United States have often become useless in the working classes as well as in the middle classes, albeit not in higher strata. Rosin notes the persistence of a slender upper layer of masculine domination in the highest strata of society. This last point intrigues anthropologists since matrilineal systems in Kerala and among the Na of China were most often topped by a patrilineal keystone. Are the last bastions of masculine domination just residues destined to be eliminated or irreducible universals? I will try to answer this question. The functionalism that I apply is not, however, that of those anthropologists who thought they were studying immobile societies in which the functional interactions between the various elements of the social structure were meant to ensure the stability or even the immutability of the whole. It is a moderate and dynamic functionalism which simply postulates that the modification of one important element of the social structure will most often lead to the modification of other important elements. It defines historical sequences in which anthropological, religious, economic, and ideological traits interact in an endless succession that is history. Thus, it obliges us to ask the question of a possible relationship between the rise in equality between men and women and the decline of collective feelings. Mankind has experimented widely in matters of mores, but our dynamic functionalism will not accept that any example can be decontextualized and used independently of the economic or religious dimensions of the social structure. Take the institution of the berdache, mentioned above, which, among North American Indians, allowed men to take the roles of women, or, less frequently, the reverse. The berdache actually tell us that today's transgender people represent an original human possibility. But we must ask ourselves whether the institutionalization of the transgender phenomenon does or does not imply our return to an organization in human groups that do not exceed a few thousand individuals, practice gathering and hunting, lack any central coordination, and practice shamanism. We will also need to understand that being berdache in a predominantly masculine society cannot be the same as being transgender in a society that has shifted into a matricentric ideological mode. Women's liberation and the antagonism between, or abolition of, the sexes. The emergence of the transgender issue at the heart of ideological concerns must also be considered as a consequence of women's liberation, or rather of the new significance of women in the ideological orientation of our societies. It arises in the context of the growth of an antagonistic feminism, of struggle, but also, as I have said, more broadly of disorientation. Exaggerating somewhat, we could describe an ideological situation organized around two hubs. On the one hand, a radicalization of the belief in the existence of intangible essences of man and woman, now in antagonistic mode. On the other, the temptation to overcome this antagonism by bisexuality, the possibility of claiming another gender than the sex fixed at conception, not to mention the rejection of binarity and yet other conceptions. It seems pointless to me to seek consistency in these various ideological innovations. For example, it would be easy to point out that the transgender phenomenon, far from going beyond the opposition between men and women, dramatizes it. It seems to represent the quest by the individual for a sexually different but strong identity. However, we would then be faced with the latest variation of the transgender theme, a third sex capable of combining the potential of the other two. I won't get entangled in these debates, and I will settle for the social diagnosis of a generalized identity disorder. I will need to situate this disorder and its ideological formulation on the socioeconomic, demographic, and temporal levels, as dynamic functionalism requires. Today we face a quite incoherent ideological constellation that simultaneously presents the man, partner, or father as a problem, and the opposition between the sexes as outdated. The question is, can such conceptions found a sustainable society? And not simply viable in itself, but also competitive and able to survive in a world of conflict. For it's not enough to show that North American Indian societies, fully human, often very egalitarian as to the relationship between men and women, I will later show exactly how egalitarian they were, did not actually bother with strict monogamy or a rigid distinction between the sexes. One has to realize that the world of the Burdash was swept away by the English anthropological system which had gained a foothold in North America. This system was admittedly bilateral through kinship, nuclear by family structure, and egalitarian as regards the relations between men and women, but already strongly normalized by Christian monogamy and nuanced by Protestantism with a rigorous separation between the sexes. The data on the Indians of California, Oregon, and Nevada, wonderfully preserved and published at Berkeley by Driver, Stewart, and Kroeber, a huge and respectful work, form a tribute to the vanquished by representatives of the victorious Anglo-American society. We will therefore need to ask ourselves if the efficiency, demographic, economic, technological, and military of Western societies as they evolve will remain comparable to that of the more conservative societies in the heart of Eurasia that stick to the perpetuation of a more or less active patrilineal principle, rejecting the West's latest innovations in mores. Thus, I have finally tried to evaluate in Chapter 17 the economic and demographic strengths and weaknesses of worlds that face each other without being fully aware of this, matricentric and patrilineal worlds respectively. The West, narrowly defined, as we shall see, has already paid a high economic price for women's liberation. From this point of view, the COVID-19 pandemic, in its first phase, will have been a rude awakening, since it affected the United Kingdom, the United States, Sweden, and France much more severely than Germany and Japan, not to mention China. We will see, however, that economic globalization has shifted, symmetrically, the anthropological trajectory of the West towards feminism, and that of the Eurasian heartland towards a conservatism of mores, to the disadvantage of both sides. This makes the question about the long-term viability of the Western model very difficult to answer. I would like the reader to feel that my attitude is that of an old researcher who is not threatened by what the West will be like in 50 or 100 years. Nor am I an ideologue who takes sides, who deplores trends, who is nostalgic for a world that no longer exists. Women's liberation is a fact, one which has consequences for the general functioning of the economy and society, a phenomenon so obvious and massive that judging it would be as absurd as criticizing continental drift, just as it would be silly to judge homosexual liberation, or to denounce as contrary to good morals an identity crisis, which is a self-evident sociological reality. Let's observe, measure, and try to understand the phenomena that we have in front of us. Let's look for relationships between things, refusing to simply collect social facts independent of one another. In every society, there are functional relationships between the economy, education, relations between men and women, and relations between the evolutions of these various elements. But it must be admitted that the desire to understand can also be a passion. Ideology is admittedly necessary if societies are to project themselves into the future, but it can be infuriating when it denies reality, when it affirms the false. I beg the reader to accept the idea that, if he or she finds in this book an ironic remark, a joke, good or bad, or more generally something that seems to them a taking of sides or prejudice, this will simply be a prejudice in favor of research as against ideology. My only prejudice, basically, is that I'm trying not to die stupid. This book will travel down many paths, studying the differences between men and women, whether in education, occupation, longevity, suicide or homicide, voting behavior or racism, and beyond these differences it will examine masculine and feminine homosexuality, single-parent families, and the transgender phenomenon. It will try to understand the meaning of our crisis at its deepest in its economic, educational, and anthropological dimensions. Its conception was a complicated process. As with my Les luttes de classe en France au XXIe siècle, class struggles in the 21st century France, I have been greatly helped by my partner in crime, Baptiste Touveret, to whom I dictated a first text. The to and fro of intellectual speculation shifted the distribution of work a little. Baptiste has played a much more active part in the general shaping, including the clarification of the logical sequence and the division into chapters. More than for the previous book, I wrote certain chapters and passages directly. Nicholas Todd drew my attention to the D-Place project and helped us develop the cartographic app that accompanies this book. I also thank Philippe Laforgue for his assistance in the demographic analysis of life expectancies, as well as suicide and homicide rates by sex.